should go to is Dubois himself, who writes, DevOps is not about technology. DevOps is about the whole business to customer problem. The classic chicken or the egg, right? Why worry about whether it's chicken or egg or tools or culture? It's really about the client. It's about trying to come up with ways to do a better job of how you work together, of how you deploy, of how you maintain, of how you test, of everything related to that process. You're doing that because you want to make a better product for the client. That's the focus. And yet I also understand in sort of a 1.0 environment why there is that black and white. And the reason why is because if you're on the frontier, that's my metaphor, that covered wagon, in the United States in the 19th century, people swept across the United States. They stopped in towns, they got their supplies, and they went to California and New Mexico and Oregon, and they traveled there by the hundreds and thousands, and they set up new lives, and it changed the nature of the country. But when you had just a wagon and you had to go there, you didn't have an opportunity to put anything in that wagon other than what would allow you to survive. So you put tools in the wagon. That was the 1.0. That's what it's like on the frontier. And it makes sense then if you think about why some people argue again that tools are important, because in a 1.0 sort of world where you're trying to change things in your company, you need those tools to come in to be able to affect some sort of change that's dramatic. It's one thing to say, oh, well, we need to do this. It's another thing to be able to show that if you do it using this tool, this is what's going to happen. And 1.0 is about survival. Survival on the frontier. Survival in the DevOps world. If you're the first one, you're just trying to survive. You're trying to make this work. And I understand why bringing tools in and implementing those are so important. At the same time, if you live on the frontier, there are those who believe that the only way to survive, they say religion is never stronger unless you're out on the frontier because life is so harsh. You have to have faith because it's such a cruel world out there. Things happen all the time, tornadoes and hurricanes and everything else. So it makes sense, too, that some people believe that the only way to affect change on the frontier in the 1.0 world is to have faith or to believe in this ideology. My thing is, isn't it time we civilize the frontier? If we're past a 1.0 stage, what's a 2.0 stage look like? My oldest son, plays Sid Meier's Civilization. I don't know if you're familiar with that game. But you build a civilization, and you take it through the earliest days all the way up to the more civilized times right here. So you start with literally a village, and then you make your way to a point where you've taken this village, it's on the frontier with your tools, and you just survive to get by, and then suddenly you change that. You civilize the frontier. It becomes a new place, capable of fostering new growth. It becomes something that you expect to have. So DevOps 2.0 to me, some 6 or 7 years, you can argue with the date that we're into this, it would be interesting for us to start to think about this as not a tools or culture argument. I read this literature all the time. It's always interesting to me. Somebody comes out and says, well, it's just about this, you need to use these tools. Or somebody comes out and says, no, it's about this, it's about ideology. It's about both. And in a civilized world, we've got to find a way to have both of those involved. Tools make us better. And the reason why we want to get better is we want to have a more civilized, advanced sort of society. And the metaphor works for DevOps. We want to grow these communities quickly. We want them to be prosperous. And if we think about the reason why we wanted the communities to become civilized, it's because it made everybody's lives better. The reason why we want to do DevOps is not to embrace a certain technology or embrace a certain culture. We're doing it because we want our businesses to be better. DevOps is about business. And DevOps 2.0 is in the real world. It's made by real people. And what I would say is we've had time to experiment with the 1.0. A revolution started. Let's look at DevOps as something that has to modernize the processes for the next stage of the revolution. The stage where we go from just trying to survive to creating very prosperous, very productive organizations. It should get to a point where we don't think about it. We should just do it. Example I would give you about this is that, and I know this because I have a startup company and I know how much it's cost to get it going. In the late 90s, it cost $250,000 to create a web software startup. Right now, it takes $10,000 because of the cloud and other things like that. It makes sense then if you are a startup company with no money and you want to save money and you have no infrastructure, you're going to use DevOps. And you hear a lot about these companies saying, well, I use DevOps, it's wonderful. Mostly they're companies that didn't have a previous sort of architecture in place. But for an enterprise organization that already knows how to do things a certain way, they're not just going to adopt stuff without thinking about how to integrate it. They've already established themselves as successful. They have a way of doing things. They know how to integrate tools. They have processes for hiring people. They've been making money for a long time. They want DevOps. The stats tell us that. The Puppet Lab survey, other things tell us that enterprise companies that don't have it want it. Those that have it are trying to make it better. But it can't just be black and white for them. It has to be something that's mature enough that when they adopt it, it's going to be reliable, it's going to be iterative, and it's going to guarantee success. I use this as an example. I use it when I teach in my classes. My students look at it like I'm crazy. That's a 1927 Rolls-Royce. The reason why I have that up there compared to the 1920s Model T is that the more successful car, or the uglier one, is at the bottom. The Rolls-Royce was magnificent, handmade. If you had the money, you'd want to have a Rolls-Royce. The problem was nobody had the money. The car that everybody bought was the 1920s Model T. The genius of Ford in industrialization. I just saw something on TV today about how people are predicting we're in our fourth industrial age with the way we make things. What was genius about Ford was he figured out a way to make people work together, no silos, along the assembly line. They did their job, but they knew that their job was this thing that was connected to this thing, so by the time it got done, the car literally drove right off the floor. The other thing he did that was also genius was that he figured out a way to make it so that people that worked there could buy the car. So they could not only build it, but when they got done, they could buy what they had built. Unlike Rolls-Royce, nobody could buy that. My point is, that's a classic example of where somebody changed culture and technology at the same time. Technology industrialized the process, but he also got the people to see why they were doing it. This is why. This is what you get out of it. Ultimately, it made a great business, but the way he got the buy-in was because it was transparent so people could see what the process was. To me, that's real-world 2.0 DevOps. For it to work, everyone has to understand and buy in. Everyone has to know their role, and the process of making a better product for consumers must be the driving force, and that process includes culture, employee training, and tool selection. So, I'm throwing this out here for debate or for whatever else, but I mean, they'll be popping up everywhere where people say this, but if we use the metaphor again of the civilization, there has to be laws that rule people, so there should be laws for DevOps. Many of them you've heard before, but I'm going to throw some out. The first law I have to make DevOps 2.0 work is that everyone in your organization must understand DevOps. DevOps is not making the developers be full stack and answer calls at 2 a.m., although it's a good idea because once they do it at 2 a.m., they're going to fix the bug, right? It's also true that when you build things and you want them to work, it is important to get everybody to buy in, like Ford did. Everyone needs to know what everyone else does, and everyone needs to know what they do. And it's not developers, it's not admins, it's not engineers, it's also executive, it's also project managers, it's also customer experience evangelists. It's everybody in the organization needs to understand their place in implementation. And the fact is that breaks down silos. You teach your people to understand DevOps, at some point it becomes what's called tacit knowledge, right? Everybody just assumes that's what they're doing. When we get to maturity in DevOps, nobody's going to be talking about it. It's like Web 2.0, 3.0, whatever. Now, one of the ways you can do that in your organization is give good examples of how it's worked, tell stories, other things like that. Hire advisors early on. It's important to bring people in that understand it. Bring trainers in so they can help you understand it. That's a great jump start, but at some point internally you've got to build corporate knowledge. It's crucial. And the law, too, is you must promote collaboration. So don't let people hide inside their roles. We talk about silos, but silos are not just developers working together with themselves and nobody else. It's also people get trapped in their roles. I have a software developer that's worked for me for a long time at my company, Grinbath, and every once in a while he'll slip into this thing where he'll say, well, I don't do hardware. And so we'll have to have a conversation where I try to explain to them, I understand you do hardware, but you do hardware because your job is to make it so that they work together. People need to know what it is they're supposed to do that's different now than what they did before. They can't hide behind what they thought they were supposed to do. And that sort of transparency is critical. It creates collaboration. And you need to put practices in place that do that. It also creates empathy. I'm a big believer. Boeing has been doing this for years. I don't know how familiar you are with communities of practice. Communities of practice are fairly organic and evolutionary. They just kind of pop up, and there's a lot of literature on them. But, okay, so here's one of the dangers of DevOps. Say you create a DevOps team, right? So you create a DevOps team because you want to see how that's going to work. Well, instantly, if you're not careful, you'll create a DevOps team, and they'll go over here and create their own silo, which is a DevOps team. So how does this get back to the community at large? One of the things about communities of practice that's an ideal sort of way to think about this is that you'll notice that by the way it's designed, it doesn't allow people to live inside their roles. Boeing uses this exclusively. You may be an aircraft engineer, but you don't fit into a role where you work with 40 other aircraft engineers. You work on a team or inside a community. You don't give up who you are, but who you are is implemented inside this community of practice. There's a knowledge sharing that's naturally fostered. Trust is built up. It's built up around not role, but practice. And that's a good way to approach this so it's less siloed. And it works effectively. There's an ROI to this if companies like Boeing are doing it. There's a great quote by Wenger. He says, communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. That's the community part about the practice. Communities of practice, as time goes on, create their own knowledge, and everybody shares in that knowledge. You may still work in a cubicle someplace, but the idea is that you're communicating routinely over these events or practices or projects that you have to implement. You're still a developer, but you're not a developer who only does these things. Your sole purpose is to contribute to the community. It's a great quote by the science guy. Everyone you will ever meet knows something you don't. And that's sort of the idea behind communities of practice again. And it's not just developers and systems engineers. Everybody's inside this community of practice. Leaders, people that would normally not be in there, non-technical people, they're all inside that because their job is to grow this community of practice around the product, and then ultimately it's supposed to deliver to the users or to the community of consumers. Law 3, you have to empathize. It's a great quote. Empathy allows software makers and operators to help each other deliver the best possible, right? Functionality and operability on behalf of their customers. So empathy is one of those things, it doesn't have to be touchy-feely. How can I make other people's jobs easier by what I do? This is one of the dangers. If you live inside your role, then you're only going to think about what you need to do to get your job done for the day. What can you do to make other people's jobs better? Some people are very good at this. I would argue that the whole point of the culture part and also the tools part, tools can allow for empathy because it creates transparency. So transparency's there, and the tools allow for empathy because the developers will be able to see, look, my code's not working, it's causing problems. The QA people will come in and say, look, these are the issues. By having the tools there and also having a community there around it, everybody will understand and finally hopefully get the idea, this is a problem. We need to work together on this. There are other things you can do too. Go outside the building. In Lean UX, they call it Goob, get out of the building. Make your teams go outside the building and communicate with users. Here's another crazy idea. Make developers be systems engineers for a little bit, like I experimented with in 1998, or do it vice versa. Not permanent. Let them shadow. We call it in UX, we call it shadowing the user. Let them shadow each other so they can understand just how much they have to do to help the other people do their job better. It creates that sort of team environment. Law 4. This is the part about the revolution part that doesn't end. You have to encourage revolution in DevOps. DevOps is by nature evolutionary, which means it's constantly evolving. Promote entrepreneurism. Right? Excuse me. So what do I mean by promote entrepreneurism? There's a danger, I've seen this going on, and I've made the mistakes before. There's a danger that you try to find the person that perfectly fits every single skill that you say they need to have to be a developer or a systems engineer in DevOps. A lot of times they'll just put DevOps on it now. I read a great story the other day about how some people are going away from even looking at that now because everybody's putting DevOps on all their stuff. Let's assume they have to have skills. The next thing we should assume is we really want problem solvers. You know what we do? When I hire somebody who's a software person at Grinbath, I assume they've passed technical stuff. Nathan, my CTO, he checks them for that. I ask them to solve problems. I give them impossible things to do as a part of their interview. And I want to see how frustrated they get, and I want to see whether or not they come up with things that go a little bit outside the box. Because I want to see people take charge of stuff. And there's a real danger, if we respect DevOps, we don't want to top down this. We don't want to suggest that all the rules have to come from above. What we want to do is we want to encourage people who are entrepreneurial to come up with new ways to solve problems. Let the teams that you create govern themselves. And the fact is that DevOps is supposed to allow for people to take the reins and do that. This is anti-waterfall. You've got to give that up. It encourages risk. I just touched on this briefly, but this is controversial. Hire wisely. I've hired a lot of people, and unfortunately I've fired a lot of people. Not as much as an enterprise organization, but startups, some people just can't be startup people. I also teach people. So it's ironic that my job is to train people to be really good jobs, and then sometimes I fire them on my other job. I guess I have to deal with that. I think the job title thing is interesting. Puppet Lab came up with a great list. Be able to code and script and use open source tools. These are implied things they should have. Be comfortable working across functions. Be comfortable with frequent code testing and deployment. Be experienced with IT systems and services. These are not title related. These are just basic core skills. But I would also say that they need to be problem solving collaborators. They need to be people that can learn well from failure. It's a great sort of approach because as my close and most of DevOps also suggests, failure is just a part of the game. We fail all the time. We assume failure in how we automate our processes. In fact, failure is assumed so that we can continue to do continuous delivery, and yet we know there's going to be failure. Failure is part of the game. We want people who can handle that and not blow up. We want people to understand what they do and the perspectives of others. And I will tell you this too. I think people you promote from inside your company are always the best way to go. We get into a trap where we bring in people that are hired guns, and they come in and help. And it's important early on if you want to jumpstart it, but at some point, bringing people up from the ranks who have had to learn this the right way as they go through, gain the skills, those are sometimes, in the Army, they call them the sergeants, right? My dad was in the Army. My father-in-law is still in the Army. They always tell me the same thing. The sergeants are the ones that keep the Army together. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. The people that keep it moving are the ones who've been promoted up through the ranks. They're the ones that you want to have in your leadership positions. Law 6. You must establish a clear design strategy and implement it consistently. This is one of the interesting things. If you get caught up in this, tools, or you get caught up in culture, they become these abstract things. You need to have a design strategy, and it has to be implemented consistently, and everybody needs to know what it is. What are your design objectives? And you don't have to be a design shop. If you're an enterprise company that you don't think does design, when it comes to DevOps, you do design. What do your teams look like? What do your processes look like? What are your objectives? Everybody needs to know what they are in your organization. Kyle Bruner calls this mind share. So his quote is, discussions cut incisively to the core of design challenges and get solved much faster without the drag of a struggle. Design velocity and capacity invariably increase. When everybody knows what the objectives are, that's tacit knowledge that we just assume is a starting place. In fact, Brunner's argument is the next frontier in DevOps is aligning sort of the quality user experience that's almost separated now by a wall with quality design and execution. It's the same that becomes the focal point. In fact, Alina Wheeler writes this, design is intelligence made visible. which I think is, everybody should know what it is. It expresses who you are as a company. I touched on this briefly, but transparency is gigantic, and transparency is just not culture. Everyone needs to know what's happening at all levels of the organization, good and bad. There should be reporting infrastructure in place. If QA is going to report, that should be legible and understandable and not just go up, but go across the organization laterally. Stand-ups, which are big and agile, I would argue that not just developers should do stand-ups, but everybody should do stand-ups. Everybody should be in a position, excuse me, where they're having to explain what they do, and everybody sees what they're doing. And then when it comes to technology, as I said, version control tools are a great example of transparency. That's not just culture. Version control tools show transparency. You know what happened when it happened. Configuration management tools obviously track and control changes to software. That's about transparency. Application and server monitoring tools show performance. These are all examples of tools and culture blending together to create that transparency. Everybody is not allowed to be in a role, behind a wall, or in a silo. Law 8. Take a strategic approach to adopting tools. So, no one size fits all, no blanket sort of package. What do you need when you begin to do this? What are your business requirements? What's your workflow? What's your budget? What are your staffing skills? Do you need to bring on jumpstart people? Do you need to hire an evangelist early on? Do you need to do some training? Do you need to take a look at your legacy systems? Don't just buy a one-size-fits-all. Think about what it is and how you should implement it and how you should go about doing it. This is not mine again. This is from Walensky, but it's great advice. Does QA have to wait for the provisioning of test environments? Does committed code get bogged down in testing? Do you have to revise committed code too often because it won't run in the production environment? You identify the bad things your tools do today, and you fix them or get new ones. If your tools are clumsy, people won't use them. If they encourage people to do the wrong thing, then people will do the wrong thing. Be strategic about how you go about adopting your tools. And obviously, the easy way to look at that is we know what the sort of core categories are. So make sure that if you're going to do implementation, you're looking to cover your CM or configuration management. You're looking to automate that. You're looking at application deployment, monitoring, version control, obviously testing and building. You're making sure you check those things off, and you've got a strategy for how they go together, and you've got the people that work with them, and you know why you're doing it. Am I doing it just to stay ahead? Am I doing it to catch up? Or am I doing it because it's going to help me do this next thing? This is my last law, but I think it's important. That up there is the Little Dipper. The Little Dipper up in the stars, at the very bottom of the Little Dipper is the North Star. In the United States, when slaves were running away, they were told every night that you knew you were going in the right direction if you just followed Polaris or the North Star, which is at the bottom of the Little Dipper. It's really important for us to understand that what keeps us focused in this discussion of DevOps is that at the core of why we're doing this is because we ultimately make things for people to buy from us that they use. All we are doing, and internal and external users. When I say users, I don't mean people over there that are waiting for us to buy something from us. I'm talking about people internally that use things. Systems engineers that use the code to do this and that. Developers who need to get feedback. These are all users. Everything we're doing with DevOps is designed to try to make this process better because we want it to be better for users. To me, and I'm biased, but I do not regard UX as different from, in fact, I would tell you that I regard DevOps as our first opportunity to break down walls, not just between developers and systems engineers, but to also break down walls that don't exist, that we don't want to exist between the users out there. The reason why we do DevOps is we want to be better working together so ultimately the product flows out. We can make continuous updates to it. We can monitor it. And that goes to users. DevOps is about trying to make all of that work together. And that's the way I focus on it. It's certainly the more civilized DevOps. Lean UX is a great sort of tool. When it came out as a process, Lean UX has been a great way to transform usability so it's not at the end of the waterfall stage. You can do Lean UX. Anybody can do Lean UX. It encourages DevOps teams to work together. Rather than thinking about a finished product, you can do lean UX very quickly within your group. Everybody can do it inside a community of practice. One of the problems with Agile, right, is with the sprints. A lot of times the UX people can't keep up or stay ahead the way they need to. Lean UX sort of mitigates those problems. I would say this: if we spend all of our time thinking about users, then maybe we're going to do whatever it takes so that we can make what we make for them better. And this is not a touchy-feely, I'm a business person. I'd like somebody to buy my startup for a lot of money, and then I'd be rich, right? It makes us money. The reason why we do DevOps at the end of the day, if we're an enterprise company, is we believe this will make us a better company to be more efficient, or we wouldn't adopt it, and to make better products because people will buy them, or we would not adopt it. We remember the users not because we want to make their lives better necessarily because we love them so much, although we probably should love users. We're doing this because we believe this is going to make the way we go about doing our business better. It's interesting. This is not a positive quote, but I'm using it as a positive quote. You may know this, but many developers hate DevOps. There was an article I just read on the plane over. I hadn't read it until I was flying over. It said, "Why DevOps is bull," whatever, you can fill it in. What he was saying is, you don't need DevOps because DevOps is this right here. You take a bunch of really skilled, passionate, talented people who don't have their heads shoved so far up there, and you can fill it in, that they can take the time to learn new things. People who see the success of business as a combined responsibility is equally shared. His argument was, you don't really need DevOps, you just need this. It's kind of a trivial truism, as they call it. You really do need DevOps because that's what teaches most of us to make sure that we do that. This is sort of the exceptional argument. In other words, if you find the right developers, they're already DevOps people. So there are great developers out there, great systems engineer people, great project managers, but they've been trained to do it a certain way. You have to implement DevOps. And that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about getting rid of the black and white. We're talking about making it something that's a more advanced sort of thing that will be adopted by the enterprise companies out there. It has to be planned. It has to be integrated carefully. It can't be something where you just push a button and make it work. It also can't just come from the ground up. You have to think about it strategically. That's the difference to me between the argument that we see for the 1.0, where it's about, well, it should be this or it should be that. It should be all of it. In a more advanced sort of approach to real-world DevOps, we're trying to solve problems. We're trying to solve problems so our business will be better. And we have to think about it in strategic ways. Okay. That's all I have. Thank you very much.